Somewhere in the deep, dense jungles of Vietnam, the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and screaming fill the air. Amidst the chaos, a young Viet Cong fighter grips his AK-47, draws a steady breath, and charges forward into the fray against the South Vietnamese forces and their powerful U.S. allies. His eyes burn with steely resolve. He's not just fighting a war, he's fighting for a unified Vietnam under North Vietnam's flag. This is his land, and he'll defend it to his last breath. He raises his weapon and unleashes a storm of bullets toward the advancing enemy. In the almost 20-year-long Vietnam War, a complex series of actions and turning points unfolded, many driven by key North Vietnamese leaders who shaped the conflict from the very beginning. Most notable amongst them was Nguyen Sinh Cung, better known as Ho Chi Minh, the founder and first president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, a position he held since 1945. Ho Chi Minh had led an interesting life before the war. He spent time overseas, traveling to countries like France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Through his travels, he learned much about the different political ideologies that existed around the world, but took a particular interest in communism. This knowledge helped him emerge as one of the leading figures of the Vietnamese independence movement, which battled French colonial rule and formed the Viet Minh, also known as the League for the Independence of Vietnam. When the country split in two in the 1950s, Minh made several key decisions that would ultimately shape the way the entire war would play out. In 1959, he urged the Political Bureau of the Community Party, or Politburo for short, to send support to Viet Cong fighters in the South, and so approving the start of a so-called People's War. He was also a driving force behind the July 1959 invasion of Laos, which led to the formation of the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of roads and trails stretching from North Vietnam to South Vietnam via the neighboring lands of Laos and Cambodia. The trail would be invaluable for the North Vietnamese throughout the war, allowing them to send supplies and reinforcements to the Viet Cong quickly and in relative security. In 1960, Ho Chi Minh was faced with yet another big decision. The war had dragged on for years with no end in sight, and at 70 years old, Ho Chi Minh believed that it was time for a new leadership to take the reins of the Communist Party, so he stepped down. Although he remained a powerful influence behind the scenes, the title of Party First Secretary was officially handed to Le Duan, a founding member of the Indochina Communist Party, which would evolve into the Communist Party of Vietnam. Fiercely committed to a communist ideology, Le Duan believed that it was the only path forward for a unified Vietnam. Rising through the ranks of the party, he eventually became its second most powerful member behind Ho Chi Minh, and it was his 1956 report, The Path of Revolution in the South, which partially led to the party approving support for its southern comrades, initiating the People's War and triggering conflict across the southern part of the country. Then there was the mastermind behind North Vietnam's military operations, the man responsible for planning battles, crafting strategies, and steering the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, toward victory on the battlefield. General Vo Nguyen Giap. A man of extensive military experience and pedigree, Giap joined the Communist Party in 1931, quickly becoming one of Ho Chi Minh's most trusted allies. He became the commander-in-chief of the People's Army of Vietnam in 1941, leading anti-colonial forces throughout the First Indochina War to liberate Vietnam from the French. General Giap was a military mastermind capable of turning the tide of battle through shrewd tactical decisions. He knew that the ultimate success or failure of North Vietnam's war effort rested in large part on his shoulders. Together with other key leaders and generals of the Communist Party, these three men would pave the way for North Vietnam's eventual success, albeit with numerous challenges, losses, and sacrifices along the way. Back in the fighting, the North Vietnamese soldiers faced one of their biggest challenges in 1965. A young Viet Cong fighter trudged through the forests of Vietnam, part of a small group of PAVN soldiers, ordered to relocate to a new area. Suddenly, he lifted his eyes to the skies. A strange sound comes from above, something he had never heard before. Loud and powerful, it sent vibrations across the landscape. Then a much louder and more terrifying sound, a loud boom off in the distance, then another and another. American bombers filled the skies, unleashing fire, death, and destruction from above. Operation Rolling Thunder was living up to its name. On the ground, panic set in. The soldier and his comrades, gripped by fear and uncertainty, huddled beneath the trees, unsure where to run, unsure if they'd survive the next few minutes. The jungle shook as explosion after explosion tore through the canopy, each blast louder than the last. The soldier could only sit and listen and wait for it all to end. He could only imagine the scores of people being wiped out with every explosion, and the damage to homes, villages, and farms. His thoughts turned to his own family's rice farm, the fields he'd tended alongside his father, mother, and siblings before joining the People's Army in its fight for a better future. He vowed that if he survived this day, he would fight on, playing his part in defeating these foreign invaders and freeing his country once and for all. Luck was on his side. The sound of explosions eventually fades into the distance before dying away altogether. But he knows he won't be safe for long. The American planes could come back at any time, but he was determined to see his mission through and make it back to his family. One thing was certain: in the wake of the increase of American activity, the war would never be the same. A great deal of pressure now fell onto the shoulders of the North Vietnamese leadership group, including Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap. The increasing involvement of the Americans completely changed the game. The party leaders knew the Americans had the advantage of superior firepower and equipment and could easily overwhelm their forces. But this was their land, and they could use that to their advantage. They had to adapt their strategy if they were to have any chance of winning the war. In December 1965, Ho Chi Minh and the party leaders gathered to discuss a new plan. From this point on, the Viet Cong would no longer attempt any kind of head-on attack with the Americans, unless the odds were seen to be strongly in their favor. Instead, they would take inspiration from the Chinese guerrilla fighters who fought under Mao Zedong in the Chinese Civil War. They would make use of surprise attacks, ambushes, hidden runs, striking here and there at the Americans, picking and choosing their moments with care. The aim was to deal small and significant blows over time and use their knowledge of local terrain to their advantage. The leaders also knew that they still needed a much bigger force, so they stepped up recruitment efforts across the north as well as dispatched more troops in secret to the south. Another key element of the Viet Cong strategy was the extensive use of underground tunnel networks and hidden base camps. These allowed fighters to strike without warning and then vanish from sight. Some of these tunnels already existed, having been built during the 1940s and 50s in the fight against French colonial rule. They were simple tunnels, mostly dug by hand by villagers, to shallow depths and used for hiding weapons, important documents, or even people. But for this new war to be a success, the tunnels would need to be much deeper and more elaborate. So the orders were sent out. Across the country, Viet Cong soldiers and villagers were urged to expand the existing networks and build entirely new tunnels. The ultimate goal was to create a vast expanse of subterranean safe spaces, continuing to supply an underground cache where soldiers could hide and stash weapons and ambush the enemy. It was backbreaking work. Soldiers and villagers alike suffered the aches and pains of continuous digging, but they all pushed on in a collective effort to help propel their side to victory. They understood the value and importance of the tunnels thanks to the posters, pamphlets, and radio broadcasts of the party, which helped to spur them on. As well as working on the tunnels, the Viet Cong soldier and his fellow fighters were also given new instructions about how to engage with the enemy. They had to become masters of guerrilla warfare, learning the art of the ambush and surprise attacks. Traveling across their newly formed network of tunnels, they would move like shadows or ghosts, impossible to track. Chosen because they were small in stature and body weight, the soldiers selected to spend much of their time down in the tunnels could easily and quickly get from place to place. They were forced to adapt to being underground, to not seeing the sun or feeling fresh air on their faces for hours or days at a time. They moved through tight passages, even sleeping and eating underground, day after day, night after night. It was a challenging environment for the soldiers and countless others like them across Vietnam, but it was necessary. This was how they would win the war. So they made the most of the situation and strived to adapt. Next, they were taught how to create a vast variety of traps like punji sticks, spiky sticks made from bamboo and concealed beneath the ground in camouflaged pits. They were often placed in trails and other areas the American soldiers were likely to walk through. The hope was that they would fall in, become impaled, and die of infection, or it would force their units to extract them from the pits and take them back to base for medical aid, delaying the unit's progress. The Viet Cong soldiers also learned to deploy grenade traps. A piece of string would be attached to the pin of a grenade at one end and a stake in the ground at the other, forming a kind of tripwire. When enemy soldiers triggered the wire, the hidden grenade would explode beside them. The Viet Cong also relied on numerous other traps, from snake pits to gigantic wooden balls with spikes all around, set to fall from great heights when a tripwire was triggered. For large parts of the war, much of the soldiers' time was spent constructing and placing these deadly traps. The soldiers also took part in surprise ambush attacks, wearing leaves and foliage to blend in with the jungle environment. Soldiers sat like statues, their fellow fighters hidden all around, waiting and watching for the enemy to arrive. Eventually, a platoon of American soldiers moved through the area. Armed with superior firepower, they held a technological edge, but they didn't know the jungle like the Viet Cong. Haunted by stories of comrades impaled in hidden traps, the U.S. troops advanced with caution, eyes scanning the trees above, the ground below, and every shadow in between. They watched for tripwires, punji pits, and unseen enemies that could strike at any moment. The Viet Cong soldiers waited for the right moment to strike with precision. Bursting from the bushes, they wiped out small units of American soldiers and forced others to scatter and flee into the wilderness, where their strategically placed traps dealt even more damage. With each successive ambush the Viet Cong soldiers took part in, their resolve and belief in the cause grew. These were small victories, but they added up. In time, with persistence, the Viet Cong believed they could be victorious. However, in the offices of the Communist Party leadership, opinions on the fate of the ongoing war were mixed. Ho Chi Minh, for instance, was eager for the war to come to an end. This, after all, was the man who, in a speech in 1945, quoted the Declaration of Independence of the United States. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was an intentional inclusion. He wanted to point out the hypocrisy of their enemy, at that time the French, as well as to make clear to his people that he wanted them to enjoy those rights. But as the war went on, the ongoing strain, combined with the reports of American bombings wiping out huge swaths of the population, began to take its toll on him. Indeed, before the Americans even arrived, Ho Chi Minh had made multiple efforts to seek peace. He reached out to South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963 to offer a possible peace agreement. He also took part in subsequent meetings to try to negotiate deals with the U.S., but all fell flat. Unable to seek peace, Ho knew that North Vietnam needed more support if it ever hoped to win the war. So in April of 1965, he made a secret visit to Beijing, where he met Chairman Mao Zedong. The pair discussed a Chinese support plan for the PAVN, with an agreement that China would not take part in the fighting, but they would send support troops to help maintain and restore the infrastructure damaged by the American bombing runs. But other members of the Politburo feared China did not look too kindly on this arrangement. However, Ho, with the support of Le Duan, saw the plan through. Even with help from China, the bombing by the Americans was intensive and destructive. Entire villages could be wiped off the map with one bombing run, and the PAVN suffered incalculable casualties. One of the biggest conflicts between North Vietnam and the U.S., the Battle of Drang, also produced a mixed response. This took place in November 1965 and represented the first big helicopter air assault by the Americans, focusing on two key landing sites in Vietnam's Central Highlands. It was a major test for the PAVN, a large-scale battle against a mighty foreign force. While the North Vietnamese outnumbered their opponents with an estimated force of 2,500 PAVN soldiers compared to 1,000 Americans and 900 fighting South Vietnamese, the PAVN suffered the biggest losses. The Americans claimed victory based on having killed more men than they'd lost. However, on the North Vietnamese side, military officers like General Vo Nguyen Giap argued that the battle had been invaluable for their future in the war. Through it, they had learned how to deal with the American forces and counteract their aerial superiority. The tactic was to rapidly engage the Americans at close range. That way, any aerial forces would no longer be able to help, for fear of killing or injuring their own men. The aim was clear: close the gap between them and the U.S. soldiers and negate the effectiveness of their choppers and bombers. This, in part, was what fueled and informed the North Vietnamese strategy over the next couple of years of the war. They avoided any large-scale conflicts out in open areas, where they could easily be picked off by American air support. Instead, they kept their attacks small and calculated, often within dense patches of jungle or surprise attacks in and around seemingly innocent villages. And so the war waged on, with the American bombing runs continuing to leave chaos in their wake and the North's forces picking off U.S. Army platoons bit by bit. Months passed in this manner, with both sides claiming their own victories, but no major progress was really made, one way or another. So in January 1967, General Nguyen Chi Thanh, leader of the Communist forces fighting in South Vietnam, headed to Hanoi for a crucial meeting with the Communist Party leaders. During that meeting, General Thanh expressed his fear that the Americans could be preparing to invade Laos and cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, crippling the PAVN. But Thanh had a plan. He urged the party leaders to consider a dramatic all-out offensive with the hopes of winning the war in one swift, deadly blow. Le Duan listened closely to General Than's ideas. He liked what he heard. He expressed support for the plan but faced a strong opposition from General Vo Nguyen Giap, who argued that guerrilla warfare had worked so far and should remain the primary strategy of the People's Army moving forward. He said that Than's plan was doomed to fail, as American firepower was simply too strong to overcome, even with one big concerted effort. The meeting ended with no clear conclusion. The Politburo was divided, with contrasting opinions and no clear consensus. The leaders agreed to think further about the plan and discuss it in greater detail at a later date. In July 1967, Ho and the rest of the Communist Party Politburo convened once more for another crucial meeting to discuss the state of the war and their plans for the future. The conclusion of their discussions was clear. The war had reached a stalemate. The presence of the Americans had completely stalled the PAVN's efforts, and they were having to focus almost all of their energy and resources on maintaining the Ho Chi Minh Trail rather than gaining any ground in the south. Something had to change. Opinions remained mixed amongst the party leaders regarding General Than's plan for an all-out offensive, but support was starting to build. Becoming increasingly old and frail, Ho still dreamt of seeing a unified Vietnam before his life came to an end. Seeing that most of the leadership group now supported the offensive idea, he made the call and added his approval. From that moment, the Viet Cong began preparations for a huge offensive maneuver set to take place on January 31, 1968. This was the Tet Offensive, one of the defining moments of the Vietnam War. While Giap didn't agree with the plan, he went along with it and he played his part in the preparations. The plan was laid out during the celebrations of the Vietnamese New Year, otherwise known as Tet. Viet Cong fighters from both the north and south would launch surprise attacks across American-held cities around the south. It was a meticulously organized maneuver, and General Giap, together with other military leaders, used all their strategic knowledge to ensure it went off the way it should. He even helped organize the circulation of false information, just in case the Americans captured any soldiers or tried to find out about the plans via other means. Plus, the Vietnamese leaders ordered a series of small decoy attacks throughout the latter part of 1967, leading up to the big day. They hoped that these little attacks would fool the Americans into thinking that the Viet Cong were continuing with their usual tactics and had no grand scheme of any large-scale assault. The biggest of these distraction attacks came on January 21, 1968, with the Battle of Khe Sanh. Orchestrated by General Giap, the attack centered on a United States Marine Corps outpost, the Khe Sanh Combat Base. PAVN forces surrounded the base over several months, launching artillery, mortar, and rocket strikes daily. Again, this attack led to heavier losses on the PAVN side than the U.S. side, but it served the purpose that General Giap had planned. It distracted the American forces and forced the enemy to bring reinforcements up to the base from the south, weakening the targets of the Tet Offensive. On January 27th, the next step of the plan was enacted. Hanoi made the public announcement that its soldiers would hold a 7-day ceasefire in honor of the Tet holiday. Again, this was done in an attempt to trick the Americans and South Vietnamese forces. The U.S. wasn't fooled, and it kept its troops in position ready for anything. However, the South Vietnamese army commanders actually allowed around one-third of their troops to take leave for the holiday. The North Vietnamese soldiers remained alert. January 31st arrived, and around 80,000 troops were ready to take part in Vietnam's biggest surprise attack of them all. They hid in a secret location in the suburbs of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, waiting for the signal to strike. Crack the sky, shake the earth. That was the slogan issued to the soldiers ahead of the battle. These words held immense power and meaning. They inspired and motivated them in what would surely be the greatest battle in their fight for freedom. The signal came, and the regiment emerged from hiding to rain down fire on any enemy forces, bases, or buildings in their way. Elsewhere, PAVN and Viet Cong fighters launched coordinated assaults across the city, unleashing mortars, rockets, and any weapons they could find. Their targets included enemy bases, barracks, police stations, radio towers. No structure was off limits. In one of the boldest moves of the offensive, a Viet Cong unit reached the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, blasted a hole through its perimeter wall, and opened fire in a hail of bullets, turning one of the most secure locations in the city into a war zone. In all, more than 100 other cities were targeted in total, and General Giap received the first reports. The plan had been successful. The Americans had been caught completely off guard, and major damage was being dealt to their infrastructure with every attack. The offensive continued for several more months in multiple phases. The result, yet again, was big casualties for the North, with around 20,000 of the initial 80,000 troops being killed. However, those losses also brought certain benefits for the North Vietnamese war effort. The attack ultimately proved to be a major turning point in the Vietnam War. While it was a military failure, the Tet Offensive sent shockwaves across the world. In the U.S., media coverage of the offensive led to a massive shift in attitudes regarding the war across the nation. Many Americans now felt the war was essentially unwinnable or would at least result in too much loss to be worth persisting. Then President Lyndon B. Johnson also announced a temporary end to the bombing of North Vietnam with an offer of peace talks in Paris. Those talks began in May 1968, though negotiations proved extremely slow and were interrupted by the U.S. presidential election. Johnson declined to seek re-election and was succeeded by President Richard Nixon, who announced a Vietnamization strategy. This involved gradually removing U.S. troops from Vietnam while arming and training the South Vietnamese soldiers to carry on the fight on their own. With this, the potential end of the war started to come into view. Ho Chi Minh wouldn't live long enough to see peace in his country. It's September 2, 1969, and Ho was now 79. With so much back-and-forth fighting and the outcome of the war still uncertain, Ho Chi Minh passed away from heart failure just before 10 a.m. in his Hanoi home. The news of his death soon spread far and wide, having a profound impact on the North Vietnamese forces, from high-end military leaders down to the lowest-level soldiers. To them, Ho Chi Minh had long been a steadfast symbol of unity and resilience in the face of foreign oppression. The news hit the North Vietnamese fighters hard. They had looked up to Ho Chi Minh all their life, dreaming of the day when he might take his rightful place as president of a unified Vietnam. Now that day would never come. The fighters struggled with morale in the hours and days following the news. But calling on the resolve and grit that had gotten them this far, they slowly started to recover, reminding themselves of what they were truly fighting for. Not just one man, but the entire country, its people, and its future. That was more than enough to restore morale and spur the Viet Cong on to continue giving their all and laying their lives on the line for what they believe in. For Vo Nguyen Giap, the news was also saddening and distressing, but he didn't let it distract him from his duties. Ho Chi Minh had in many ways prepared for his passing. He, together with other members of the North Vietnamese leadership group, had helped establish a collective of key figures to maintain the plans and strategies put in place. Vo Nguyen Giap was part of that group, alongside others like Pham Van Dong and Le Duan. He knew his duty to ensure that Ho Chi Minh's death did not disrupt the war effort. In other words, despite the death of a great and noble leader, nothing had changed. The war would continue. The goal of unifying Vietnam under communist rule remained. The passing of Ho Chi Minh also came as a major turning point in the life of Le Duan. He had already succeeded Ho Chi Minh as the de facto leader of the Communist Party of Vietnam in 1960, becoming the party's first secretary. And at the time of Ho's death, despite being part of a collective leadership group, Le Duan was clearly the most powerful member of the party. So it was he who in 1972 took control of planning for North Vietnam's next major offensive movement, the Easter Offensive, yet another pivotal turning point in the war. By this point, General Vo Nguyen Giap's influence had waned somewhat, especially in the wake of the heavy losses of the Tet Offensive. He still held a high position in the party, but was largely replaced in terms of planning and strategy by another experienced general, Van Thien Dung. Together, Le Duan and Van Thien Dung plotted a truly massive attack. It was a huge departure from the long-term strategy up to that point of focusing on small-scale ambushes and hit-and-run attacks. The Easter Offensive, instead, was a head-on assault, intending to win the war for North Vietnam once and for all. It all began on March 30, 1972, with PAVN soldiers launching a huge barrage of artillery fire on the South Vietnamese outposts in the northern sections of Quang Tri Province. A 30,000-strong force then pushed through the demilitarized zone, targeting Southern Army bases. Elsewhere, larger forces rained down fire of their own, sending masses of men and tanks to take territory from the Southern Army. Thus began an almost 7-month-long conflict, a back-and-forth battle that started well for the North Vietnamese. That was until the South Vietnam Army, with the help of the U.S. Army aerial support, regrouped. By the end, although both sides claimed victory, peace talks rapidly accelerated, with both sides eager to end the war at last. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed by North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States. North Vietnamese party leaders celebrated perhaps the most important victory of their campaign. With the peace deal signed and favorable terms negotiated for their side, their goals were at long last within reach. With the United States now definitively out of the fight, General Van Thien Dung prepared for the final phase of the war. Once the understudy of General Giap, he was now the top commander of North Vietnam's forces, and he was ready to deliver the decisive blow. Even though the peace agreement had stipulated an end to the fighting, combat broke out almost immediately after the accords were signed, with both North and South sides attacking and retaliating against one another. This was enough of a reason for the North to push ahead with their plans, safe in the knowledge that no American bombers or platoons would stand in their way. General Dung's plans ultimately led to the decisive 1975 Spring Offensive, in which the South Vietnamese government finally collapsed. The North Vietnamese forces claimed control of multiple major cities, from Hue to Da Nang and beyond. April 30th would prove perhaps the most significant day of all. North Vietnamese forces, many of whom had been serving for several years by this stage, entered the southern capital of Saigon. They flooded the streets, killing, capturing, or forcing any remaining South Vietnamese soldiers to flee. Victory was so close, and victory did indeed come soon. The fall of Saigon effectively heralded the end of the war. The South Vietnamese forces surrendered, and Vietnam was unified the following year. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the man who had led the North Vietnamese to what some might call an improbable victory. Want to see how another major battle looked from the other side? Watch D-Day, but from Nazi perspective, to discover how Germany saw the storming of the Normandy beaches, or click on this video instead.